Okay, we're going to have a look now at the poem London Snow by Robert Bridges. Hopefully many of you will be quite familiar with it because this was one of the poems that came up in your mock IGCSE exam. So let's start with the two different colours. So we've got in blue structural points that we could talk about, and in yellow I've highlighted some of the key language moments in the poem, and going to sort of talk through all of that. Obviously these aren't the only things you can talk about, and there are many other things that could be said about this poem. It's quite a long poem, but let's start with the title. So you'll notice immediately I've highlighted here a structural point, and that is because London Snow, I think we could say, is an example of assonance. And that is obviously when we have this repeated vowel sound. We might think what the effect of that assonance here is. London Snow, does it create a sort of gentle, soft tone immediately? And that's something we're going to see continue throughout the poem, this idea that the snow has this sort of calming effect, if you like, on London, and perhaps that assonance hints at that right at the start. So let's look at the first few lines. So when men were all asleep, the snow came flying in large white flakes falling on the city brown, stealthily and perpetually settling and loosely lying, hushing the latest traffic of the drowsy town. So when men were all asleep, so this idea that the entire city is sort of uninhabited almost at the moment because everybody is at home in bed, tucked up, asleep. But the snow, meanwhile, is being very active. It's flying, not just falling, but flying, perhaps giving it almost a sort of magical properties, as though it's sort of not just coming down, but it's going everywhere. It's covering the entire city. In large white flakes falling on the city brown. So here Bridges sort of sets up a contrast in the two different colours. So obviously, we've got the white flakes, and we might think what some of the connotations are of this colour, a kind of purity perhaps is one thing we might say. Typically it's a white colour associated with sort of innocence as well, something along those lines. Falling on the city brown, and so there we get this contrast, and if we take that out there, we can see perhaps some of the connotations here. It sort of suggests maybe a kind of a dirtiness to the city. Certainly it's in stark contrast to the white flakes of the snow, and then we get these sort of adverbs describing how the snow is falling. So it's falling stealthily and perpetually. And again, we might want to sort of zoom in a little bit on those two words and consider the effects that they create. I mean, stealthily, that to me certainly suggests it's happening. It's almost a sort of a little bit sneaky, perhaps we could say. It's not being noticed perhaps by the inhabitants of the city at this point because they're all asleep. It's quiet. It's happening gently, but it's also happening perpetually. And so here we get this idea that this is a kind of a constant falling of snow. And we see later on in the poem it says, full inches 7 have fallen. So this makes sense. The snow is coming down thick and fast. And then it is settling and loosely lying. And here I've highlighted this as a structural point because similarly perhaps to the assonance, here we have some alliteration. Now I think we're all familiar with what that is, but again the key here is going to be talking about what the effect is of that alliteration. And here I think perhaps you could argue that it creates a sort of gentle lilting tone, this loosely lying. And what is the impact of the snow on the city? Well, it's hushing the latest traffic of the drowsy town. And again, actually, I think that's perhaps a word to look at and to zoom in on a little bit. This idea of the town having become drowsy. We're getting a sort of personification here, aren't we? Really, of the city and what the snow has done to the city. It's sort of made it drowsy, perhaps linking a little bit to the people who are all fast asleep still. And then we get this sort of trio of sort of present continuous verbs which describe what the snow is doing to the city, and it's deadening, muffling, stifling. So 3 really lovely words actually, and we can sort of see what Bridges is saying is happening to the city. It's sort of being slowly kind of covered. If it's muffled, it suggests a sort of a quietness perhaps to it, as though everything's sort of being covered in this soft, thick layer. And stifling is an interesting word. It has arguably, I think you could say, sort of slightly negative connotations, as though the snow is somehow stopping the city from expressing itself fully, almost, if you like. And what's it stifling? Well, it's stifling, it's murmurs failing. So we're talking here about the town, and what's happening to the town, and its murmurs failing are being stifled. So even the noise of the city is described as a murmur, or as being a series of murmurs. And obviously we know that murmurs, it's quite a sort of a gentle, soft sound, isn't it? A murmur, it's not a shout. So it's gentle, soft sound, and even those soft sounds are already failing. Okay, so we're seeing here the power of the snow to change the city somehow. And let's move on here. So now, still talking about the snow and how it is falling and appearing in the city, lazily and incessantly floating down and down. Now, incessantly, I think we could link very, very nicely with this word perpetually. Okay, so the snow just keeps on coming, floating down and down. And again, here you'll notice, like the assonance in the title, down and down, creates the same effect, I think, of a sort of a softness, a gentleness to this to this snow falling. And then Bridges continues, silently sifting and veiling road, roof and railing. Really lovely line here, and there's quite a lot going on. So again, we have the sort of the sound effects. You'll notice throughout the poem, Bridges makes real use of sound, and sort of contrasts the sounds caused by the snow, or the lack of sounds. The silence is often with the town, the sort of the sounds of the town, if you like, the sort of the normal hustle and bustle, and the way that is no longer going on today under all this snow. So silently sifting, I've picked out here again the alliteration to check your spelling. It's over there, and it's veiling road, roof, and railing. Now, veiling is an interesting word. Obviously, a veil is part of a wedding dress, and it's used to sort of cover the bride's face before the wedding, and the snow is performing a similar function here. It's sort of covering the town, and Bridges lists 3 of the specific parts of the town here that are being covered: the road, roof, and railing. And here he sort of develops this idea, what the snow is actually doing, what effect it's having on the town. It's hiding difference, making unevenness even, into angles and crevices, softly drifting and sailing. So if we take these 2 lines together, we can sort of see that one of the effects of the snow, at least, is to sort of to change the city and to make it seem neater somehow, hiding difference. All of the kind of the sort of cracks, if you like, perhaps in the roads, or the unevenness of the different sort of buildings, or the pavements, or whatever else. It's all sort of being flattened out and made into this sort of neat, beautiful landscape. And I mean, he even says, here it's sort of the snow is drifting into angles and crevices. Okay, and so we can imagine the way that it's sort of filling those and creating a kind of an even layer across the city. And here he uses two more present continuous verbs, as he has done with deadening, muffling, stifling. Here he's saying that the snow is drifting and sailing. So, just in terms of even the motion of the snow, we've had flying, we've had now drifting and sailing. So we've got these sort of quite interesting active verbs. He sort of really seems to be granting the snow, or trying to convey the snow as quite a kind of, powerful force. Even in its gentleness, it's quite sort of active. And then, there are no sort of official stanzas within this poem, but I think that section that we've gone through there is, would be the first stanza, I think, if he had divided it as such, because he kind of moves on a little bit here and describes the way that this continued. All night it fell, and when for Lynch's 7 it lay, in the depth of its uncompacted lightness. So the snow hasn't yet been touched by anybody walking on it or anything like that. So it's uncompacted. It's not been sort of pressed down together, and it's got this lightness, which again I think we could see almost perhaps a double meaning in there. It's light in the sense that it's not heavy, but also perhaps there's a kind of a lightness to it in terms of the colour of it. The kind of lightness, the whiteness of it as well. So it's sort of weightless, but also quite bright. And now he sort of continues this idea of something to do with light. He says the clouds blew off from a high and frosty heaven. So the idea that these clouds, they've delivered all of their snow, and then they sort of move out of the way. They blow away, and we have this high and frosty heaven, which I think again is a really sort of lovely image. We might talk about the high heaven alliteration there, and what happens? Well, obviously, once the clouds disappear, the sun comes out, and all awoke earlier for the unaccustomed brightness. Now, unaccustomed, obviously, people aren't used to this brightness, and we can imagine that this sort of white landscape with the bright sunlight reflecting on it has sort of caused people to wake up and think perhaps what's going on in this winter dawning. And this is interesting, the strange unheavenly glare. And I was thinking, I wonder why he's used this word unheavenly. Surely, he might have gone the other way and said, actually, it's a heavenly glare. But I think perhaps he's emphasizing the fact that, this is London, this is on Earth, and it has sort of transformed the city in quite a sort of remarkable way. The glare, obviously, again, the reflection of the sunlight onto the snow, and the eye marveled at the dazzling whiteness. Now, this isn't anybody in particular's eye, so I think we can assume that this is anybody sort of looking out at the city covered in snow. And note he repeats this word, so that's why I've put it in blue as a kind of example of repetition, and this idea of marveling, the sense of sort of wonder, perhaps even we might go so far as to say awe. People are really amazed by what they're seeing, this dazzling whiteness. Dazzling, again, quite an interesting verb. I think it's not verb, adjective, and I think it sort of links perhaps with the idea of the glare, the idea that the sunlight combined with the snow is so vivid, it's so beautiful. It's almost like a sort of beautiful jewel or something might be described as dazzling. Dazzling whiteness, and again, that links back to what we were saying earlier about some of these connotations of the colour white. And now, having described rather nicely what the eye saw, he talks about the ear, and thereby sort of introduces some of the sounds, if you like, associated with a sort of heavy snowfall. Just as a side note, really kind of good poem, I think, for thinking about descriptive writing techniques and the idea that we sort of appeal to the different senses, and I think that's something Bridges certainly does in this poem. So let's explore a little bit what is going on here with the sounds of the city. So the ear hearkened, that's just a slightly old-fashioned way of saying listened to the stillness of the solemn air. So again, in a similar way perhaps to the way that it sort of made unevenness even, here it sort of leveled out the sounds, and there isn't the normal hustle and bustle of the city. Instead we have this stillness, and the air is solemn. And so solemn, suggesting something quite serious perhaps, which links, doesn't it, with the idea of it being quite quiet. You might describe the atmosphere in a library as being a little bit solemn or serious. It's sort of quiet. And he explains why it's so still and so solemn. There is no sound of wheel rumbling nor of foot falling. So presumably, any kind of vehicles are not braving the snow at this point, or are unable to make their way through the sort of 7 inches of snow. And there's not even the sound of a foot falling. There might be people walking, but again, if you imagine what it's like to walk on a thick layer of snow, it's very, very quiet, isn't it? But there is some sound. The busy morning cries, but even these, which sounds like it should be quite a loud sound, a busy morning cry, but they come thin and spare. So perhaps, the linking back to this idea of muffling, perhaps even the sounds of the city are somehow being muffled by the snow. They're not sort of reverberating off the hard surfaces, instead they're sort of being absorbed into this thick layer of snow. And so the ear perceives these sounds as being thin and spare. So again, they're slightly they're dulled. You can't hear them at full volume. But then there are some sounds, and typically it's boys making a racket. Then boys I heard as they went to school calling. They gathered up the crystal manna to freeze their tongues with tasting. So we have this image of a bunch of excitable schoolboys who are sort of heading off to school, but they are obviously, as is only natural, distracted by the snow. And so what do? Well, they gathered up the crystal manna. Now this is an interesting metaphor for Bridges to use. Manna was food sent down by God from heaven to feed the Israelites as they were sort of wandering through the desert and were short of food. So it was sort of considered a gift by God. And if we think about it in those terms, it gives the snow, again, a certain sort of set of properties. So could we even go so far as to say that it is a form of spiritual nourishment, perhaps? Is the snow somehow feeding people? Not necessarily literally, obviously it's just frozen water, but in terms of what it does to their spirits, it seems to sort of perhaps lift their spirits. It gives them a kind of a sense of joy and pleasure, and so in that way, it could perhaps be likened to manna. And their tongues with tasting, and so this alliteration functioning quite differently here. This is quite a sort of sharp sound, isn't it? Tongues tasting, perhaps capturing some of the kind of the joy and the excitement and the energy of these boys as they sort of play around in the snow, and their hands are snowballing. So as well as sort of tasting the snow, they're also making snowballs out of it. And then we get these sort of rather vivid verbs, sort of again showing the impact of the snow and the excitement that it creates for these schoolboys. They rioted in a drift. A riot suggesting sort of, actually it's almost sort of chaotic and disorderly, isn't it? But I think here, I don't think it really has particularly negative connotations. It just sounds as though there's a sort of powerful sense of enjoyment, and the snow has sort of energized the schoolboys a little bit as well. They might normally walk to school in a rather sort of bleary-eyed way, but not today. They're sort of rioted in a drift, so in a sort of a pile of the snow, plunging up to the knees. So again, another very kind of vivid verb, which suggests their energy and their enjoyment. I think that goes quite nicely together with rioted. So they're plunging up to the knees, or other things they're doing. Say peering up from under the white mossed wonder. Now this is quite a nice image. I think it's very sort of subtle bit of description, but he compares the snow to moss, and I think this metaphor actually works pretty well. They're both you can sort of, I think you can really imagine the similarities. There's this sort of a layer, as you would get with a layer of moss. It's sort of cold, wet, and so I think that that metaphor, in terms of the description, is quite an effective one. It's sort of subtle, understated metaphor, but effective. But it's not just obviously white moss; it's white moss wonder. Okay, so again, linking to this idea of joy, energy, enjoyment, that kind of thing. The sense of awe, AWE, created by the snow. And look at what they say. The boys, "Oh, look at the trees," they cried. "Oh, look at the trees." And so here we have a bit of direct speech. We can see that with the speech marks. So I've highlighted it as a structural point from that point of view. And also it's obviously an example of repetition. And the repetition, again, perhaps suggesting almost a sense of disbelief and amazement. "Oh, look at the trees, look at the trees." And we can imagine, that they're impressed by the way that the snow looks on these on these trees, creating quite a sort of beautiful, impressive, towering image above them. But then the focus shifts again, and we move away from the schoolboys, and we go slightly now more towards perhaps the world of work, which certainly how the poem ends as well. So, with lessened loads, a few carts creak and blunder, following along the white deserted way. Now, lessened load, I've highlighted here the alliteration. Does it create perhaps a sort of a sense of the lightness, the lessened load of these carts? And we might think, well, why have they got lessened loads? And again, not absolutely sure, but perhaps just everything has kind of come to a bit of a halt. The things that they would normally be carrying in their carts. Maybe their deliveries haven't happened. Things have sort of all been slowed down quite considerably. But there are a few carts, no, just a few. Okay, so it's it's not the city as normal, and he's just sort of highlighting that there are, there's a little bit of activity going on. These carts creak and blunder. Okay, now blunder suggesting perhaps a sort of sense of confusion or uncertainty, and we might think why that is. Well, obviously it's quite difficult to drive or to pull a cart, I suppose, along the snow. It's sort of slippery. You've got to be careful. You can't really necessarily see all of the road clearly, that kind of thing. So blunder, again, quite an interesting word if we're thinking about the effects of the snow on the city. Following along the white deserted way. Now, deserted again, very, very interesting word. He's told us, Bridges, that is, that there isn't much going on in the city at the moment, but here deserted suggests, it's almost like a kind of, a ghost town. It's very quiet, empty. Certainly not the London that we sort of normally experience. He talks here about a sort of a group, and perhaps these are the people who were sort of pushing the carts. A country company, long dispersed asunder. So this group, this company, have dispersed, and I think again the word fits quite nicely with deserted. This idea of sort of quietness, emptiness. The people have all sort of moved away now. There's not a whole lot of activity going on. And here he sort of changes focus again. When now already the sun in pale display, standing by Paul's high dome, so that's St. Paul's Cathedral, by Paul's high dome, spread forth below his sparkling beams and awoke the stir of the day. So actually, what we've had so far really is just the snow falling. Then we've had the first sort of the pioneers, if you like, have gone out into the snow, and it's the school children having to get up early. But other than that, it's pretty quiet. But now, as the sun sort of is a little bit higher in the sky, we're a bit later on in the day, and we begin the stir of the day. Now, I think the word stir is quite interesting. In terms of how it's describing the motion, it's as though something very, very sort of settled and quiet is just gradually starting to awaken. Okay, so gradually awakening, and we have a few other things here to look at. So in pale display, so the sun. And I thought this was quite interesting, the use of the word pale, perhaps linking to all of the descriptions of the whiteness, because they're almost synonyms, aren't they? If something's white or pale, it's quite a sort of similar thing. So there's this pale display of the sun, and it is spreading forth below his sparkling beams. So, a fairly kind of standard poetic device, but the personification of the sun. I'll just add that in. And again, what would we say about this in terms of the effect? Well, it seems as though nature in this poem, particularly the snow, but here also the sun, has this power. It has a power to sort of to change the city from one thing into something quite different, from a kind of noisy, bustling, loud, kind of dirty, grimy place to one that is quiet, gentle, silent. And the sun too is given this sort of power, I think, through the personification, and awoke the stir of day. So this sunlight, the beams of light, are now kind of signalling the proper start of the day. And here the tone changes slightly, I think, because so far we've, generally speaking, had quite a lot of sort of appreciation of the snow. But here something slightly different happens. For now, doors open and war is waged with the snow. Now, this is quite interesting. In what sense is war being waged? Well, it sounds as though, if we read on, trains of sombre men, past tale of number, tread long brown paths as towards their toil they go. So, while the school children, perhaps in their youth and their innocence and perhaps because of the novelty of seeing the snow, they might not have experienced this many times before, were really excited. The men initially don't seem quite so excited. They're described as somber. Okay, so again, sort of serious. They're not necessarily sort of particularly amused by the snow, and certainly the idea that they have to wage war with the snow. This metaphor is it is quite an interesting one. It shows perhaps that they are kind of irritated by the snow. It's something that's just a bit of a it just makes their day that bit trickier, something to navigate and negotiate. Or is it because as we continue, we see that actually things slightly change? We might have a little sympathy with these men. After all, going toward their toil they go. Toil, obviously, very hard work. The last thing perhaps that they want to do is first have to sort of slip and slide across the snow to get to work. But actually, Bridges then goes on to say that even for them, even for these men who are sort of, perhaps they've seen it all before, they've experienced this before, and they just want to get to work, and they can't really be bothered with the snow. But even for them, a while no cares encumber, their minds diverted. Okay, so the snow, even for these sort of older men, and perhaps women going to work, their minds have been diverted, distracted, and again we see the power of the snow, its ability to stop people in their tracks, and perhaps to sort of marvel at the beauty of the scene. The daily word is unspoken. Now this is interesting as well. The daily word, it perhaps suggests a kind of an automatic response to one another. You can just imagine walking past each other saying, morning, how are you, that kind of thing. These kind of insignificant, just little idle bits of chit chat. But again, and perhaps also linking to the idea of the silence before, the daily word is unspoken. This is not just another normal day where the normal things are said. This is something special, something a little bit different. And the daily thought, so again, repetition of this word, daily, really emphasizing the way that this is not just another normal day, because the daily word is unspoken, and the daily thoughts of labour and sorrow slumber. In other words, is asleep or dormant. So all these normal things, the daily word and the daily thoughts, which are very negative thoughts, by the way, of labour. So the kind of the work and the sorrow, the sadness that perhaps goes with that, going to these sort of dull, difficult jobs. But these things don't happen. Not today. The snow has, even for these older people who are perhaps a little bit more cynical, a bit more jaded, even for them, the snow is something a little bit special. And here we see why. Bridges explains in the last couple of lines, at the sight of the beauty that greets them, for the charm they have broken. So the beauty that greets them. So again, we have here a sort of personification of this beauty, of the snow. It's greeting them, it's welcoming them, it's making them forget their sorrows and their kind of their day-to-day sadnesses and whatever, and in their lives. But then the poem ends on quite a sort of ambiguous, in quite an ambiguous way, perhaps you could argue, because it says, for the charm they have broken. So the charm, again, suggesting something that has them a bit enthralled. It's something that has got even connotations of magic, perhaps, as the snow really has these sort of magical properties, but they have broken. Perhaps as they start walking through the snow, they're sort of making it dirty, and how the snow is very lovely initially, but then for days afterwards you get this sort of greyish brown slippery sludge, and perhaps Bridges is hinting that process is already underway as these men sort of start to trudge towards work. They're kind of changing the snowy landscape, and and perhaps we might expect that actually, what we're going to get back to before too long is this sort of the city brown and all of the sort of the unevenness and the difference coming back into the city. So, you know, it's rather a nice kind of cycle, I suppose, of the snow falling and the effect of the snow on the different sort of groups of people, but then at the end that perhaps this subtle hint that actually things are going to ultimately return to the way they were before, and that this has been a sort of a temporary change in London and a temporary beauty that has been sort of lent to the city for a while. So as I said at the start, obviously that doesn't cover absolutely everything about this poem, but hopefully it gives you a few things to think about. If you have any questions or anything that is unclear, please do leave a comment, and we'll do our best to get back to you. But yeah, hope that was helpful.